this video, I will use 5 different techniques to paint on this 300-pound sheet of cold pressed watercolor paper, 100% cotton. This is actually half sheet. The size is 22 inches by 15 inches wide, and I hope you will agree with me that the result will be bright clear colors and interesting textures. The first technique is wet on wet painting. I have a big soft brush, so I'm just going to spread a little bit of clean water to wet my paper. The paper I started with is dry. I didn't wet it under the tap or anything. It's a dry sheet of paper that I pinned to my drafting board just to keep it in place for filming. 300-pound paper is often called thirsty paper, so I will need a lot of pigment because I'm using pretty large format. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the ceramic cups that you see, and I'm going to squeeze some pigment straight out of the tubes so I can make a nice big puddle of which color I'm planning to use for my initial wash. These are New Gouache by Daniel Smith, and also Opera Rose and Winsor Red by Winsor & Newton. This is number 24 synthetic brush, and my first layer will be kind of an abstract painting. I want this watercolor to be loose and semi-abstract. For now, I'm not even looking at my reference photo. I'm just trying to distribute some colors on my paper and let watercolor do its magic, float and mix together and create a nice basis for my leaves that I will paint on top of it. So you see, I am dropping pigment onto wet paper, also onto first yellow layer that I threw in there. I'm using splattering. I spray my colors from my spray bottle to help them mix together. And I can do all this thanks to my really thick paper and thanks to cotton fibers that can withstand all this water being sloshed around and moved around and mixed together. I do realize that for beginner watercolorists this demonstration might be a little complicated, but just view it as a library of techniques that you'll be mastering over time, practicing and learning. And even the pigment that I squeezed out was not enough. I ran out of my puddles, so you see, if I was using like pans of watercolor especially, or even my regular palette with little wells, it will be very hard for me to pick up enough pigment to cover this big sheet. To help my watercolor distribute and to make the edges a little more interesting, I use a very large soft brush. It's dry, and I'm just going to help my watercolor to run and mix together. Keeping in mind that watercolor will lighten at least 2 shades after it dries. I can see that I need to add a lot more pigment in some areas. I'm squeezing a little more yellow, and I want to add some of it to first of all make my background even more interesting, but also to make it brighter, because even though it looks super bright right now, you will see in a minute how much it will light. Paper is still holding up. It's not warping, even with this massive water and pigment application in several layers. So this was our first technique, wet on wet. Alright, my first layer is dry. You can see how much it lightened. I printed out my reference photo that I'm using as inspiration for this painting, and I'm going to transfer it onto my sheet of watercolor paper using charcoal that I rubbed on the backside of the printout. It's not that I particularly need an accurate drawing, but I like this reference photo and I want to have just a guideline to give me a starting point. Alright, that's done. Now I am opening my palette with all my watercolors. I spray them from my spray bottle. I also have a little bit of pigment left in the ceramic cups. I'm going to use that too. I don't want that to go to waste. And I can also use these cups to mix new colors. And I'm going to start painting. The wash I have on paper right now will become my light mid-tone. And right now I'm going to paint my darks. Not the darkest darks, but dark mid-tones. So I'm going to find all these shadow areas on my reference photo and approximately reproduce them on my painting. The second technique I'm introducing is wet on dry. So my paper is dry and I'm applying wet paint to it. You see I'm using 2 brushes. I use flat brush to apply the pigment. It holds a lot less water than a round brush, so I can pick up a lot of paint with it. Our goal is to have very bright saturated colors. And I also use a clean round brush with clean water, which I have in a separate container, to soften some of the edges. Variety of edges, that's what makes or breaks a piece of art. So I want to have some hard edges, which I'm creating with my flat brush very easily. All those cutouts on the leaves, flat brush is great for painting that. And I'm also using a round brush to soften the opposite edge and make it softer. I can also use a dry brush to kind of spread out the paint and make the edge even more interesting, kind of feather it out. So that's another technique. I might sound like a broken record, but please notice how this thick sheet of paper withstands all the rubbing and brushing and all the layers of watercolor that I'm applying on it. The colors come out really bright. You will see in the end they will be even brighter. I'm trying to stick to limited palettes, so I used New Gouache, Opera Pink, and Windsor Red, and now I'm mixing Windsor Red with Daniel Smith's French Ultramarine to create nice purple color that works really great for my shadows. I also introduced a little bit of blue into wet areas that I just painted, and that gives me even more variety of tone and color in my shadows, so they're not all uniformly purple, but there is variety of color. So trying to find those leaf forms, and to a certain extent I'm painting negatively because the light areas are already painted, so I'm adding the shadows in between those light forms. It takes a little bit of a brain adjustment because you're not painting what you see in the reference photo, you're painting the spaces in between those leaves. So that's why we call it negative painting. This is a very effective technique. I use it in a lot of my paintings in watercolor. It's not easy to do, it takes some time and patience, but I think results are worth it. Okay, so at this stage I am painting the dark areas in between all the leaves. And as you can see, I am not following the reference photo exactly. It's pretty complicated. I could just kind of copy it, but I don't think that's the point. This is a loose style of watercolor, abstracted style, so I think it's more important to create a beautiful painting than to copy a reference photo. You know, what's the fun in that? For the top leaves, I want the shadows to look a little different, so I mixed a tiny bit of Cascade Green into my ultramarine blue, just for variety. Okay, my leaves also have very bright red branches. It's a small brush, pure watercolor from the pan, and you can see I'm not worried about those little blue berries. I think I will paint them on top. I'm going to use ultramarine blue for them. It's a semi-transparent paint, so I think I will be able to paint them on top of what I already have on the sheet. I'm going to add even more pigment to my dark areas. You see that right before our eyes, as they dry, they lighten. So while they're still slightly damp, we can drop in more color, and the bottom edge will kind of automatically soften itself. Just be a little careful when you do this. Do not drop in water or too much water. It needs to be pigment, otherwise you will get very unattractive blossoms in these areas. Starting to work on small details. I'm painting some of the veins on the leaves with my small pointy brush. Again, you want to have a variety. You don't want everything blurry and kind of flowing. Some details need to be sharper. These leaves in the middle, they are closer to us, so the details on them will be more pronounced. We will see them better. So that's what I'm trying to do with my small brush. Bring those leaves forward. My colors are becoming a little too subdued, so let's throw in some pure red in a few spots. You can see the light hits some of these leaves there in the center. I think it's a beautiful effect, so I'm going to add some pure red in just a few areas, also to create a focal point on my painting. When you see my brush kind of hover and hesitate over the painting, in real life those pauses were a lot longer. It's very important not to get too carried away when you're painting and to step away and look at your painting and see what it needs. Not just stare at it all the time and keep painting as fast as you can, or just look at your reference photo. It's important to kind of listen to your painting and make a pause and see what it needs, so you can preserve balance and harmony in your painting at all stages. You know, it's not something you kind of achieve in the very beginning or at the very end. Your painting needs to be harmonious and balanced throughout the painting process. That's the secret of success, especially with watercolor, where it's a little bit difficult to make changes. I would say harder than with other mediums. And here is yet another application technique. It's kind of reverse wet on wet painting, because I splatter color first or apply it with a brush, and then I spray that area from my spray bottle. After that, the color starts to run and mix. And again, the paper is thick. It can withstand this much water and pigment. This effect will be hard or impossible to reproduce on thinner papers, because they will just buckle or disintegrate. And on 300-pound paper, this technique works great. When my painting is starting to take shape, the second layer is ready. I'm going to let it dry, and all I have to do is just apply a few more details, kind of get everything balanced. Now that I applied brighter and darker colors in certain areas, I can see that my initial background can use a little more pizzazz. I'm picking up some opera pink. You see I'm almost out there on my palette. I'll need to squeeze a little more in a minute. But some of these leaves that look all the same, I want to add a wash of opera pink to give them some variety. This will be my fourth technique that I'm using in this painting. It's called glazing. So I'm going to glaze some of the leaves with a transparent wash of opera pink and a transparent wash of new gamboge of this yellow paint to create the illusion of sunlight that falls on these leaves. Adding yellow and especially splattering it like this, I think works great for watercolor, and it really gives you an interesting varied texture that's not dull or muddy. You kind of adding light to your watercolor, so I use that a lot, splattering of yellow. Okay, let's take a look what else our painting needs. Oh yes, we need to paint our little blueberries. Now it's time. I'm careful to paint them on dry areas. I want them to have hard edges, so as we remember, we get hard edges if we paint on dry. So let's kind of approximately distribute them as we see them in the reference photo. I'm using ultramarine blue in very high saturation, straight from the well. My brush is not wet, it's just damp. I don't want a lot of water. I don't want those berries to kind of float away from me. So I am picking up a lot of pigment and painting the berries. I'm not worried about the stems yet. I can connect them with stems later. I just want to distribute them. Okay, now picking up a little saturated Winsor red and connecting my berries with some branches. And while I have this Winsor red on my brush, I'm going to side my painting, even though I still have a few final touches to apply to it. I'm going to balance overall painting a little more, work on the leaves, add a few more details. Leaves are interesting because the areas where light hits them, the veins are darker than the leaf itself. But in shadow areas, the leaf is darker than the veins, so you have to kind of paint negatively around the veins. I thought everything was too warm and the shadows were too cool kind of by themselves, so this mixture of ultramarine blue and New Gouache gives me a nice slightly olive green that I introduced into my painting, and I think it's a nice balance between all these warm colors and the blue shadows. I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that when I'm painting leaves, I am not surrounding them with a hard edge, because that's not the style of painting I'm going for. What gives you that looseness to your watercolor is that only one edge on each subject is defined. Okay, last thing I'm going to do, I thought maybe I don't need to do it, but now that I'm looking at my painting, I see that it's necessary. I'm going to add some highlights with white gouache. So on the berries there will be very pronounced highlights, and also I think if I add a few maybe lighter branches here and there, that will break up the space a little more and add some kind of air and movement to my painting. And again, I don't want those white highlights that have to be like continuous hard edges, so I'm applying them just a few spots, trying to vary the edges even in highlights. White gouache is great for correcting edges, so some of the leaves where the edge didn't quite work out, or I kind of changed my mind about what kind of edge I want, it's very easy to correct it with white gouache. If you apply it in small areas, it will be almost unnoticeable. If you apply it on large area, it can look kind of crude and out of place sometimes. But small areas, especially on this thick paper, it works really well. And let's do a little splattering with white to add even more texture to my painting and break up some of these dark washes that I applied, give it some visual interest. I'm trying to target my splatters. They will fly all over the place. With artist gouache you can pick them up with just a clean brush or paper towel if they fall somewhere where you don't need them to be. Alright, and our painting is done. Here is the final result. Let me know in comments what you think about this painting and about the techniques that I showed you. This demo is also part of my class on watercolor paper. If you want to know more about different types, textures, and how to make a right selection for you, I'll left you a link to the class in the video description below. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one here on Tamirov Studios channel. Help other artists to see this video by liking or sharing it. To see future videos, subscribe and click the bell button to be notified when they're published. Thanks again and stay creative!